so much work preparing the description, we didn't figure out what we were actually going to do here.
So you each have 2 microphones, and it would be helpful just because we're going to be recording for live stream. So if you could speak into them.
Thank you all so much for being here. This is a treat. These are 2 people that I cannot believe I'm on a panel with already. What have I done? So it's just, I just want to start by saying thank you for having us. Thank you for a lovely introduction, and thank you for the invitation to have this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see so many people come out for this. It's an honor to be on the panel with the 2 of you. Just also want to thank Common Notions, the Abolition Collective, and Making Worlds for, bringing this all together. So.
And I think Farshid in the corner there, hiding in the corner there, who had the original idea to approach Making Worlds and see what we could imagine as an event here. Mom said I'd been associated since day 0, but I think that's not quite right. I think it was day -10 or so.
Yes, that's true.
So I saw the building before there was paint, before there were bookshelves. It was it's such an exciting transformation that you all have made collectively to make this space a wonderful home in the community. But I think we're each going to say a little bit and then just open discussions.
Yeah.
You want me to start?
Wait, I'm happy to start, and I'm going to read a little bit so that way y'all can think too. So I just wanted to, acknowledge that we're having this conversation about spirituality and abolition on Sunday. I definitely called my dad this morning and interrupted service on Zoom. and was like, oh my goodness, that's so fun. And I was thinking, what do I wear? Do I wear like Sunday clothes, or do I wear my abolitionist political shirts? And so I'm glad that political shirts are represented and our Sunday best is also represented. And I think that kind of mashup does start to give a little bit of a window into the threshold that we pass through in order to have this conversation. It's been 5 years since we submitted our essays for this publication, and the world has changed, we have changed, everything is different, and yet, for my money, a lot of the things I was really worried about are coming to light, continue to come to light. And so I just wanted to read a little bit from the piece itself and do a little reflection. I actually only had the first bits of this in my computer readily findable, and shared it with my my abolitionist theory seminar just last week because we're just wrapping up reading Parable of the Sower, against some other abolitionist sacred texts that have been generative, frightening, humbling, and galvanizing in terms of what it means that we need to be doing, what do we need to be setting our mind on right now, as we watch the world that Octavia Butler spun emerge from this catastrophic period of time. Okay, so the idea was to say, perhaps the carceral logics of an abolitionist consciousness require some strategies for survival themselves, right? So the abolitionist context, the abolitionist consciousness in and of itself will not save us. We might need to have some practices therein that are going to continue to fight against the ways that we carry carceral logics into spaces of freedom without even recognizing that we're reproducing the very tools that we say we're there to dismantle. So surviving the carceral logics of an abolitionist consciousness. Imagine we were working together to make prisons obsolete. Imagine we were queer and color-led and organizing for community safety, food justice, universal housing, and an end to police brutality. Imagine we were spending more time fighting each other than we were fighting the expansion of the prison industrial complex. Imagine we were effective enough to attract funding, private and public support to acquire 5013 status, sustaining donors and local followings. Imagine our hearts and heads were in the right place, but we were coming from completely different points in the process of waking up to our own geographies of containment. As the new slavery studies historian Stephanie Camp called it, imagine we were working our edge, but from various points in our own process of bringing awareness and compassion to our own unique intersections of trauma and survival, strategies born from bearing the bodies, histories, and kin we carry with us. Imagine our mission statements were in alignment with the core principles of abolitionist activism that inspired the 1971 Attica Rebellion, but our organizational practices of hiring, decision-making, and conflict resolution more closely mirror the technologies of care and accountability born of the carceral corporatism of the nonprofit industrial complex. Imagine we had grown too burned out to notice. We've been here before, not just once, not just now, but time and again. Our movements for abolition are at a crossroads. We are the 21st century great-grandchildren of the movement to abolish slavery, and we draw strength from the past by coming together to learn what improvising on reality might look like today. More than 50 years after the state-sanctioned violence that forcibly brought the Attica uprising to a violent end, we find ourselves at yet another moment of reckoning. We have a choice to make, demands to name. Skip forward a little bit. Carceral, and then I herald all the people that help us think about these things from the academy and from activism and from movement spaces. These are the carceral logics, being able to name them, that produce the carceral effects of the prison industrial complex in ways that exceed the scenes of traffic stops, courthouses, jails, and detention centers to reach into our private lives, to live in the very places we call home. We see how quickly carceral logics and practices of policing, surveillance, and punishment persist beyond the bounds of the PIC to enter into our intimate places of refuge, shaping the relationships we have with our families, organizations, communities, and movements. Canceling people or cutting people out, policing each other's identities or politics, caretaking in ways that feel more like management than the intimacy of shared oppression. These practices are so familiar, many of us take them for granted. As Reverend Kyoto Williams claims, quote, our bodies take the shape of and thus illuminate the contours of the most insidious force of systemic dehumanization and destruction ever imagined, one which has led the global community into a downward spiral of self-annihilation. The idea here, and it's interesting that this was written in 2019, was while reading Parable of the Sower, I was thinking, what if the walls fall and we're not ready? What if the walls fall and we haven't done the work to understand how to hold each other accountable without tearing each other apart? And this is where we are. This is where we were before 2020, and it's still where we're at, even more so after 2020, is that if we're going to consider something as dramatic as withdrawing, as retreating from carceral practices, then what are we growing in their place? And my partner and I wrote this piece because we both came to abolition work with a fierce amount of passion and rage and anger, and found that we could not physically sustain that fervor over the kind of time that it's gonna take to tear this thing down. We actually really needed to have ways to be in choice about how we tear these things down, so we are also in choice about how we're building things up, because when we're just exhausted by demolition projects, we actually don't have the creative, expansive love and imagination to build something new. And so we collapse, we contract into our bodies. And so both of us found different ways to channel our rage and into all kinds of things, karaoke, going out, do direct actions, but we also needed to figure out ways to build sustainable relationships to that rage. And for me, that came through meditation. For my partner, it came through a training in somatics. And so for people who don't know about somatics is much more secular. And it's the soma is the body, and the language of the body is constantly talking to us. But because of our conditioning in academia and other places, just the condition of capitalist life in general, we tend to bypass the messages and literacy that the body is constantly trying to tell us. And as we all know, the body isn't just an isolated like vacuum, put a thing in a vacuum, right? We are life. We are in connection with the earth. We are in connection with our environment, and the environment is trying to talk to us through our bodies. If we can hear it, then we can do different, right? So how do you do different? You have to stop, and you have to sit with yourself, and you have to learn how to be with self long enough to hear what the earth, what the body, what the moment is trying to teach us, guide us towards. And so somatics was a really powerful technology that Rusia Mahudin is my partner's teacher who does this work in somatics for social justice leaders. It sounds like some folks know who that is. And Reverend Kyoto Angel Williams is the person who taught me through Zen Buddhism how to use mindfulness for wakefulness and not just tune out and tune into my own misery, which is what a lot of people do with meditation. It's just like drown out the world and turn into their own navel-gazing myopia. And so how do we stay awake, stay aware, stay in choice, and stay in practice? We have to practice. And so the piece is full of practical tools and activities to bring that about, that we wanted to share with folks within the context of like storytelling and analysis. And so I'm really excited to see it in print and be reminded of what I said I might need to know in the future, because indeed I do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed reading that piece too. It was helpful to think through. So my piece, I think, comes from a kind of different sort of origin story, which is that the idea for my piece started in a set of conversations that a group of us were having after the 2019 or 2018 national prison strike. There was kind of criticism, self-criticism, discussion for folks on the outside doing support afterwards. There was reflection from folks on the inside, and then there was dialogue about those things. And one of the things that was on everybody's mind was, despite it being a kind of media success, recognized by many as a media success in terms of a lot of coverage for the strike, that the participation inside wasn't as high as it had been in 2016. And so, part of the question that people were just grappling with and are still always grappling with, right, is what leads to politicization, what actually inspires folks to resist, particularly in a place where, resistance is so constrained and disciplined and punished as within the prison system. And so there were a set of conversations between myself and one of the central committee members from Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, which was the organization that had called that strike. And, we were talking about spirituality, and part of that is one of those conversations is reproduced in this essay towards the end of it. And there's an interesting discussion because on one level, they say, look, if we talk about religion, then this gets divisive. Like we're working towards unity. And, some of us are Muslim, some of us are Christian. We have different systems of belief that don't just mesh together necessarily, right? So we have to kind of keep that question out of it. But at the same time, there was also an orientation towards spirituality, which was that basically everyone he could think of that was a politicized prisoner had some form of spirituality. and that, in his estimation, was a motivational factor for their ability to resist, their ability to be political inside a space of captivity, essentially. And so, it started kind of this conversation, and it's kind of driven in part by that discussion, but of just thinking about slavery, right? And of thinking about how those questions, how to think about those questions in that zone of captivity and confinement and violence, right? And, I would say also, I approach this as a journalist, right? And as kind of, an activist journalist, and that I don't have an academic background. So my piece is in some ways limited by, my own lack of knowledge around like who to go to answer all these questions, right? And so, but there's a number of pieces and books that both the editors helped me with, right? And then my peer reviewers, right, to go through this process. And I mean, the first animating one for me, and I think what I wrote in the abstract, was Black Marxism, was that it was just, that it seemed like what Cedric Robinson was talking about there, although I didn't fully get it the first time I read the book, was very important to these questions. And so I think, one of the important things to say is that I think it's important to understand the resistance to slavery as, in part, a central question of sort of African sovereignty, right? Is that, Robinson highlights that the enslaved people that the masters were most concerned about, they called outlandish. And what this meant was that they were literally from another place, right? But it's also very interesting to think about that term, right? And its relationship to sort of madness or, just being, thinking otherwise, having otherwise practices. And that was quite literal in this sense, right? African slaves, as they came over, they were like, I'm not doing this. This is not how we live, right? And so that's in part what is the impetus behind like marriage, right? And other forms of resistance, is to just seek a desire to go back to, if not Africa itself, which is often literally what it was, at least the ways of sort of communal living that they were familiar with, right? And so I think that question of sovereignty is important too, because it's not just resistance to the system that is imposed, it is that, but it's also animated by what came before and what was understood already going into it, right? And a part of that then is also about spirituality, and is about what the systems, Robinson uses the term ontological totality, right? Which is to say that, enslaved people were whole people when they came in through the slave ships, right? And so you couldn't just erase their systems of thought and spirituality and belief, and that those things were the things that animated who they were, right? And how they chose to resist, right? And so one of the things, so that's something that I look at. I look at a number of scholars from Cedric Robinson, Sterling Stuckey, Catherine Dunham, Michael Gomez, who kind of examine those questions. And they look specifically at systems of African belief in ways that are, more deep than I can. Obviously, there's others too that I didn't even know of at the time that engage with that, like, Sylvia Wynter or Jacob Carruthers, right? The second point is about syncretism, right? And so it's also important to understand that they didn't all believe the same thing, they didn't speak the same languages, they didn't have the same systems of spirituality necessarily, right? And so, and part of the way that slavery worked as a system was a desire to ensure that it wasn't just all people from what we would recognize as Ghana, right, that are on one plantation together, or whatever. Like slave masters understood that that would be a threat because they would all be able to speak the same languages, organize together, et cetera, right? And so this meant that they had to sort of work out a language together, a set of beliefs together. They had to think about how are we going to organize and communicate, and what are the things that we're going to bring together to resist this, and like what weapons do we have within our arsenal that we can relate to, right? And so to me, like that's just a very important discussion of organizing, right? Of what organizing, really is. And I think that it also, obviously, you can see how that I'm not trying to draw a one-to-one comparison, but you can see the relationship between organizing in that zone and what it also is to organize in a prison. You don't have access to everything. You are limited in all kinds of ways, right? And then the other piece that the essay does is I examine specific figures, right? And it's not, I wanted to resist doing this in some sense because I don't want to make it about exceptional individuals. But I think that it was also a way to really look at some of the things that people said and read into those a little bit. And so I look at figures like Harriet Tubman, Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Henry Highland Garnett, and David Walker, to examine both what you can see in terms of the retention of those African spiritual systems within things that they do and say, but also to look at what their orientation was, especially once some of them adopted Christianity. How did they relate to that? And I think that, there's this thing that people think, which is that sort of Christianity was imposed, and that it was imposed, to make slaves docile, essentially, right? That it was imposing a Western system of thought to sort of control them, and that's certainly part of the story. But that's not how the enslaved people oriented themselves to Christianity, right? And so, just to talk about this, I'll give a couple of quick examples of some of the ways that these folks were oriented towards it. So to start, like I have to talk about the Haitian Revolution to some degree, right? And it was funny, when I started to do this, I wanted to do all of the Western Hemisphere, and then one of the editors smartly told me, like, that's way too broad, But, if we look at Boukman, Dutty Boukman, who was, led the incantation at the start of the Haitian Revolution, one of the things that he said was, the God of the white man inspires him with crime, but our God calls upon us to do good works. Our God who is good to us orders us to revenge our wrongs. Denmark Vesey, who, kind of co-founded what would be the AME Church in South Carolina, sorry. He was reported to quote passages from the Bible that authorized slaves to massacre their masters. Gullah Jack, who was born in Africa, so he was what would be referred to as an outlandish African, was one of Vesey's co-conspirators and was believed to be both invulnerable, but also to have the ability to convey invulnerability to others. David Walker talked about a God who demanded the abolition of slavery. Nat Turner spoke of a spirit commanding him and his comrades to attack the serpent. Henry Highland Garnett, a fugitive slave minister in the North, spoke of obligations to the ancestors and to future generations to overthrow the system of slavery by the enslaved themselves. He drew stark lines. The enslaved who rebelled against enslavement would be welcomed into heaven. Those who accepted the system would not be. And then Harriet Tubman, she believed that God intended to set Black people free and deliver them in this world, not in the next, not in the afterlife. And this grounded a very particular understanding of what it meant to do God's work for her, right? And so that last piece, there's another section in it where I talk a little bit about this idea of how, I don't really use the term outlandish, and I wish I did. This is one of the things that I've thought about since I wrote that essay, where I talk a little bit about madness and about, these conversations around sanity and disability and the relationship between these ideas and sort of carceral solutions and logics. And obviously there's great, academics like Minga Mingus and Liat Ben Moshe and others in the collection also that do think about those things. But everyone from Harriet Tubman to Nat Turner to even John Brown, right, is branded with this idea of madness, right? And to every, some people will say the whole Haitian Revolution, right, is animated by, madness, right? And I think it's really interesting to think about that idea of outlandishness and just thinking about literally what it means to think of another world, and to seek to, it's really about transforming the world that you're in, into the world that you want, right? And so, I'll kind of leave it there, but basically, those are some of the things that I'm exploring in the text. And the last thing is I deal a little bit actually with like Marx and Trotsky and just this idea of, religion. Marx called it the moral sanction of an inverted world, right? And this is looking very much at European Christianity as he saw it, right? And I think that what I look at is trying to think at what are the spiritual dimensions, what's the orientation that we need to have towards spirituality to then, to invert the inverted, right? To flip things right back on their head, right? So that's sort of, those are the things I would say.
Thank you both so much, and thanks again for having me here. I've learned so much from Jasmine and Jared's work in this text and elsewhere, and it's a pleasure and honor to share a stage with them, especially pleased because Roberto Servent, one of the co-editors of this collection, is a great family friend and collaborator of mine for many years. So it's great to be spotlighting the huge amount of behind-the-scenes work he does in movement building as well. So the question that prompted my book was, what do we do with the paradigm shift that we see happening around us now? There was one paradigm for managing race in the US, multiculturalism, which took Blackness to be one of many different racial differences, cultural differences, that took each racial and cultural group to have their own tasty foods and colorful clothes to be celebrated, their own particular problems that we could stand in solidarity with them to gradually diminish so that a wonderful rainbow nation could emerge. And that paradigm has been given the lie by Black justice movements. Black justice movements naming the specificity of anti-Black racism, naming anti-Blackness as qualitatively different from other forms of racism. Those Black justice movements have been saying multiculturalism is really just disguising, right, the forces of capitalism and white supremacy that are still ruling in the US even after the civil rights movement, even after the Black Power movement. So the old paradigm is falling apart. Black justice movements on the ground have made it vulnerable. And the forces of reaction are trying to defend themselves, right? They're seeing that they're losing ground, right? We see in national politics, right? Attacks on critical race theory and attacks on all, the AP curriculum and all sorts of other things, which I think we should read as happy signs of vulnerability, right? On the part of the powers that be. But it also means that we in justice movements are at a precarious juncture. Right? The old paradigm is falling apart. What is the new paradigm that will follow? That seems like a particularly tricky question because you can't see what the new paradigm is going to look like from the perspective of the old paradigm, and we're at the moment of transition. And I think it's in grassroots movements of experimentation, imagination, that the new paradigm will take shape. Which means it's pretty tricky right now. Right? We can't just say to our multiculturalist friends, right? And I think many of us grew up in this era of multiculturalism. It's become common sense, right? That racial difference is one problem among many that can be managed with enough effort, enough policy fixes, right? We can't just say, okay, you were in one framework, now here's another framework, we need to switch. Because that new framework is being born, right? It's in the process of being born through the work of movements and the imaginative work that goes along with them. So what I was trying to think through in this book was, what are the sorts of sensibilities and virtues that we find in movement spaces, particularly Black justice movement spaces, that can equip us to recognize those experiments that will lead to a new paradigm that advances Black justice. What are those sensibilities and virtues that can resource us to attack white supremacy and anti-Blackness in all of its very and entangled forms. And I take that to be a quite tricky problem, right? That in addition to the frontal assaults from more or less outright white supremacists, Ron DeSantis, etc., there is an effort by those who hold power to insert ideas into Black justice movements that will domesticate them, right? That will turn Blackness into something about history instead of something about politics, something about culture instead of something about politics. There are efforts to make Black justice movements invested in diversity bureaucracy rather than in transformation from the roots. Right? There are efforts to make Black justice movements care about personalities and individuals rather than about movements. Right? So I think naming these tendencies, right, that infect our justice movements or could infect our justice movements, and trying to figure out how to manage them in addition to those frontal assaults is really important. So that's the kind of reasoning that came to this book, and this book is meant to sort of fill out some of the concepts that circulate around, concepts/hashtags that circulate around Black justice movements. Starting with Black dignity, but as a kind of anchor, but thinking as well about Black rage, Black love, Black magic, Black futures, and Black family. Each of these holds a huge amount of promise as it emerges in movement spaces, right? As it's abstracted, as it's turned into a concept that, as I've learned from Gio, is undialectical, right? Then, its political potential withers away. I start with Black dignity, and sometimes we think about dignity as aristocratic, right? As something that you hold if you have high rank. Sometimes we think about dignity as something that each individual has inherent to their humanity. But neither of those, neither of those really gets at the sense of dignity that circulates in Black justice movements. Right? Black justice movements have been particularly helpful in naming the difference between dignity and respectability, and in seeing dignity as something that's actualized in struggle rather than as a static quality that someone has or needs to be affirmed by a legal regime. So seeing dignity as something that's performed in struggle. Struggle doesn't have to be at a protest holding a sign. Struggle can be aesthetic. Struggle can be in language, in silence, right? In prayer. Right? Struggle can take all sorts of forms, but it's struggle if it's aimed at challenging forms of domination, where the paradigm of domination is anti-Black racism. Right? Filling out that account of dignity, but then also thinking about rage as others have, Jasmine has spoken about it before. Right? There are ways of thinking about rage as being about a particular wrong But again, that's a sort of domesticating and disempowering account of rage. If we think about rage as directed at systems for which we don't have a name in our current language, right? That is the way I hear the language of Black rage circulating in Black justice movements. And similarly for Black, just to take another example from the book, Black futures. And it is striking that half century ago one heard more talk about hope, and one doesn't hear a whole lot of talk about hope in Black justice movements now, but one does hear a lot of talk about futures. And I think that that points to the really important insight that the world we want cannot be fully imagined in the terms that we have available to us in the present. Right? There's a gap between what we have now, our conceptual capacities now, and an account of the world to come, and having clarity about that, and not allowing tendencies in our current world to be sort of smuggled into the world that we desire. The tendencies toward domination to be smuggled into the world we desire is a problem that we need to name and think through and wrestle with. So in a sense, the book is a kind of experimentation, with thinking through these different terms and concepts that circulate in justice movements, offering a kind of framework for how to clarify them, and at a sort of second order level, wondering what do I sit in a university, I sit in a sort of intellectual position and doing this sort of intellectual work. I'm not the one who's going to imagine what the new paradigm is going to look like. I'm not the one to fill out the picture of Black justice. Right? I can point to movements that I think are exciting. I can point to experiments. I can point to poems and other visions of the new world that I think are exciting. But one of the things I think I can also do, in addition to pointing, right, is to help provide a way to sort through the often messy and exciting, right, language of a movement, right? The language is messy, but it's the best thing we have. Right? The best visions of justice we have are the visions of justice that are emerging in racial justice movements and Black justice movements now. So to try and name what is core to those languages, what's core to those movement commitments, and what is secondary. That's one of the contributions I was trying to make. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
That's such a great segue to the script that we don't have. Because one of the things I wanted to share with you all is that I've been in the classroom, kind of mad scientist trying to hack, like, what is it that we're actually, what is this new paradigm? Like, what do we know we're gonna need for the days that are coming, right? And I can hear it on this panel itself. And so, I draw a triangle on the board, and in the lower right-hand corner, in the middle I put, how will you know? Like, send that to Whitney Houston. And in one corner you have academic knowledge, right? And academic knowledge is a cornerstone of how we know what we know and how we'll know what time it is. And so it's like, how else do we know what we know, students? And it took them a while, but eventually they got to lived experience. And I was like, okay, cool, street wisdom. The voices from those inside, the voices from the margins, those are the people who are most directly impacted, and their witness, their testimony is knowledge. They're not just objects of study for the academics to colonize and extract, objectify, but they're actually the people who should be driving and shaping our priorities as academics, right? Which is, in a lot of ways, the way Vincent and I have talked about the work that we're doing, right? And this is also where Jared's expertise is like right there, right in the forefront as well. And then I'm like, well, what else, how else do we know what we know? And then they don't have another answer. And I say, what about embodied knowledge? What about semantics? And how are we seeing the relationship between academic knowledge and somatic knowledge. And of course, all the students are like, oh, override, bypass. We're not even paying attention to the fact that we exist below our necks, right? And so being able to think about what a classroom experience would be, what would a movement experience be, what would a field of study look like if all three were equally recognized, right, in ways that they're not right now. And then I really do put street knowledge at the top because of its kind of directing, steering, general kind of energy that comes right from the point where the rubber hits the fan. And so I was just really excited about hearing the integration of the three in the panel. Maybe should we just open it up for questions? Or any other reverb?
No, I think I'd love to have, questions would be helpful, I think.
Can we borrow one of your mics?
Yeah.
I wanted to know more about the body and spirituality, so I was wondering if you could give any recommendations for texts or practices. You mentioned meditation and the somatic work you've been doing, but I wondered if you could maybe say more about the way to integrate that into daily life.
Yeah, so the reality is that the majority of spaces that you would go to get the training aren't necessarily connected to political consciousness or political responsibility. So I just want to say that from jump, and the book that I co-authored with two other Black queer Buddhists, Radical Dharma that was mentioned earlier, is a great place to start, mostly because it starts with our frustration with going into contemplative spaces and looking for like medicine and finding more toxicity.
Yeah.
And so trying to, so that said, the kind of practices that I'm really driven by, grounded by, fed by, nurtured by, you really can't do by yourself in private. They really require witness, they really require like being seen, and being seen not being great, and being seen messing up and falling short and like trying to get it right, but like over trying, being aggressive in it. And like then as we start to witness each other's like I said, hearts being in the right place, but our behavior, our enactment is still like an algorithm from a previous paradigm, right? So really all of these practices are about learning to be a better witness to ourselves in community so that when the shit hits the fan, it's not gonna be a big deal to be like, Jared, yo, that hurt, right? Like, or be able to like call each other in ways that we've already been in a practice of dismantling punitive responses, judgmental responses to someone falling short or coming out of their face because they had a bad day or whatever it is, you know? The reality is that if we are going to learn to do this, retreat from carceral power and cultural authority in order to keep each other safe, we're gonna need to learn how to practice like witness without judgment of ourselves first. So that can happen through meditation, that can happen through journaling or poetry, that can happen through contemplative walking, you know, it could happen through Dharma and Buddhism, or it could happen through like your community being in witness of each other and just holding space, congregation on a regular basis. Like honestly, the practice that comes out of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower is so beautiful because it's a practice of focusing on the idea that change is inevitable and that we will be changed and we will affect change and we will be changed by what we affect and we will not always be in control of that. And so how do we get ourselves psychologically, spiritually prepared to not have a lot of control but try like hell to have some integrity, right? So that push and pull between effortfulness and releasing the outcome requires some kind of mindfulness practice. You need somebody, and you need someone to hold you down and love you through your inability to get it right, like the first 500,000 times, right?
thanks all so much for sharing this. It's really cool to hear. I don't have a great I'm trying to synthesize everything that the three of you were saying. I'm similarly interested in the body, spirituality, how you think that ties into dignity, and then I guess I'm curious about how does all of that from all of this I don't know bodily experience of the world with maybe experiences of enclosure, how from that does that emerge a practice of spirituality, what does spirituality mean for experience, or where does dignity come into that? So very general. But maybe all the thoughts.
Maybe one place to kind of start. So, Orasami Burton has this great article on masculine care work in prisons. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it's along those lines. And he also has a book coming out this year that's called Tip of the Spear. Looks at Attica as a long struggle over years. But I say that because he's attentive to something in that piece that I've encountered, and we just recently had a conversation that hasn't come out yet on the podcast with some folks that are organizing inside and connected to this group of people who have been basically punished around a rebellion that occurred to preserve life, essentially, with inside. The thing that gets touched on is that you would think that within enclosure, within prison, right, that, especially if you watch TV or whatever, right, it's this idea that the prisoner is this gruff, harsh, just totally kind of destroyed by the system image that you have, hyper-violent, hyper-masculine, all of those things, right? And the reality of it is usually that if you have conversations with prisoners, they're usually some of the most caring and attentive people to exactly whatever is going on with you. In a way that is just it's kind of mind blowing. It's, it's not you talk to your parents, right? Or you talk to a friend, you might say, how are you? Or what's going on? And usually those things are not, they're just sort of things we say, right? But there's a way that a lot of folks who've been incarcerated, it's very clear that no, they actually want to know what's going on in your life, and they actually want to talk to you about it. And many times it's made me sort of laugh, and I'm always embarrassed to laugh about it in some ways, right? But it's sort of you're asking me this, right? I'm free, right? And you're asking me, how I am and what's going on with my family and what are people struggling with outside and all of these things. And so I don't know that helps to answer your question entirely, but I guess I would just say that it's not, I think in line with the piece that you write, that the value of giving people attention and the value that our attention holds today, when people talk about this idea of the attention economy, but really authentically being with people in places and listening to them, and there's a form of care work there that I think we're losing because of how connected we all are to technology all the time, and that's just one of the places where I become attentive to that, I guess I would say.
Just to add a little bit, thanks for the question. And I should add as a disclaimer, I'm very bad about having titles that match up to the content of the book. So there are a few pages about dignity, but there are a lot of other things that are really the center of the book. Right, so I think often when we think about dignity as something that one has or who one is, right? It is easy to think about dignity in an unbodily way, right? And I want to say that we should think about dignity as something that we do, right? Sort of struggle against the forces of domination that infect our world in all sorts of different ways. And that struggle takes on all sorts of different forms, but it's a performance, and it's a bodily performance. And that's a notion that I think one finds it in many places in the Black radical tradition. Frederick Douglass is maybe one example. The centerpiece of all three of Douglass's autobiographies is his fight with Covey, a slave breaker, and after physically wrestling with Covey, Douglass concludes, I now have, through this struggle, I have dignity, right? The dignity is something that comes about in the process of physical bodily struggle. And that's an insight I want to sort of think with more broadly to a wider range of bodily practices.
So cool.
Thank you very much for a fascinating event. And my question is to you, Vincent. After having read your wonderful book, could you say more about your choice of the term dignity? Because I think about one of the classics, the essay of Charles Taylor, The Politics of Recognition, which distinguishes honor, which is allegedly an innate something that every person has, and is more connected to the traditional world, and he contrasted it to recognition, which is something that we all owe to negotiate politically in the public arena. And it seems that in the choice of dignity, you go beyond a mere recognition. It's almost a pessimistic act, because some forms of struggles are not recognized. And you try to find a new grammar or a new logic to think about those issues. And I wonder what the term dignity gives you in that regard.
Thanks. Yeah. So I guess first and foremost, I care about the term dignity because it's a term that circulates in movement spaces, right? That I don't think my task is being one of sort of, looking at the philosophical tradition and figuring out what concepts are central or what I want to argue with, but looking in movement spaces and seeing where are the life-giving concepts, where are the concepts that are fueling justice movements, and then from there. Perhaps putting them in dialogue with the philosophical tradition and thinking about how is struggle for dignity similar to or different from struggle for recognition or conceptions of honor. And it strikes me that the accounts of dignity and struggle that come out of movement spaces are ones that take seriously the depths of domination. Right, the domination is not just a discrete instance or set of instances happening here and there and there, right? It's something that infects, our languages, our habits, our cultures, our forms of imagining. With again, anti-blackness being this paradigm form of domination. So I think that the dignity language, dignity as struggle language, is pointing to those depths of domination in a way that the recognition language maybe doesn't.
It's super exciting to have all three of you here together, and in this space as well. It's been super productive for me, and I really just want to pull out some of the ways that I feel like y'all are speaking to each other, and this question of spirituality is super resonant with a lot of things, like really big things. And for me, I think maybe it was like Jared's discussion of Cedric and of this sort of conversation about the ways in which the middle passage is understood by some to be this absolute rupture which destroys whatever positivity and content people had and makes them into absences, right? And into sort of empty vessels. And Cedric was always good about emphasizing the fact that no, this is something that's broad here. And that something is this positivity and creativity. And it points, I think, towards the way in which all of you seem to understand spirituality in ways. And I grew up, so someone grew up as like atheists, right? Like one of those people who I think that's stuck on that piece of Marx where he says religion is the opium of the masses, and didn't read literally the next line, which said the heart of a heartless world, right? Which is a huge compliment to but also, the ways in which spirituality, like we always, I think, want to understand not the word, but the thing, like what is being described, what is it that movements are picking up, and I think very much the Latin American tradition, where you always had this tendency to be like, well, no, like in someone like Ware, in Peru, we need to spiritualize Marxism. We need to infuse it with a certain kind of will and dignity and meaning, which speaks to the ways in which spirituality is also code for, like the old debate between idealism and materialism, right? That there needs to be this sort of balance between materialism and idealism, right? Between so-called objective conditions and subjective conditions. Again, Latin America is somewhere where young people were like, we don't need to wait around for the structure to be ready for us to make a new world. We can make it because we're making ourselves in the process. And so it seems to be, a really powerful way that you all are understanding spirituality, and one that I think is, and so Jared, when you were talking about the ways in which people were bringing these modes of thinking, and that made them outlandish and dangerous and hard to discipline and hard to force into this form of discipline, that's the same thing that happened with the enclosures, right? That's the same thing that happened when people were thrown off the land, policed, brutally forced into factories, right? I think it just happened, like a little earlier. And so as a result of sort of long array result of that, there are ways in which this spiritualization is something I think that we see tendentially in third world revolutionary movements, right? The idea that we're not about sort of objective questions of structure, we're also about faith, belief, the building of alternative communities. And I think you all have brought that out here in really, amazing ways.
Yeah, thanks. I'll say a couple quick things in response to that. I think there's an interesting thing with Marx where they're so invested in the differentiation between scientific and utopian that that in part they're trying to push something forward, and I can appreciate that, right? But I think that other people have done work on this. Cedric Robinson also with like the anthropology of Marxism, et cetera, right? Look at all of these religious movements that had socialists and communistic thinking within Europe as well. And so I think the point just be that part of what I wanted to think about with this too, because I also, I grew up in the church, but I also come from a more agnostic space personally. But I do think, also go back to 2018 and the prison strike, there were a number of faith-based organizations that signed on to support the prison strike. So I was also thinking about that coalition, right? And thinking about how are we going to relate to people of faith, to justice-based traditions that come from the church or are animated by spirituality. Also this recognition that the folks that were inside that were organizing, even though they weren't organizing in a religious tradition, were animated by spirituality and understood that. And I think the thing you said about Latin America, I think that makes total sense. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to pull from stuff that Jasmine wrote as well as Vincent, kind of related to this is, Jasmine, you talk about habituations of our desire to survive and the punitive isolation of habituated self-preservation in the piece. And, part of what I hear here, right, is one, kind of this isolation, the neoliberal, individual, right, it's just sort of gets invested in self-care solely as an individual act and not as collective, communal, right? But also there's a piece kind of on risk aversion, right? And I think that Vincent in Black Dignity also, you talk about how Black people have historically realized that, quote, it makes sense to struggle even if that struggle means risking death, end quote, right? And so Robinson talks about it in Black Marxism, in Haiti, people literally shoving their arms into cannons, right? Knowing that, this is gonna be their individual annihilation, right? But they're animated by a spiritual belief, right? That this will lead to their collective freedom, and that also they're going to an afterlife that's better than, that they're going to be free one way or another through this action. And I think like, there's nothing in, to me, I mean, the closest you get within, I think, the sort of, atheistic or communistic tradition around that is like maybe the concept of revolutionary suicide, which you also look at in the text a little bit, from Huey Newton, and it's kind of also in some ways inspired by Mao. But this, this notion that, to die for the struggle, right, is something much greater than just an individual act, right? I don't know if you can say.
I can just tag on, really, that was really a beautiful response. And so the only thing I have to add into it is that even within the abolitionist tradition, the balance isn't there, usually, right? I was just thinking about the kind of pivot, the like pendulum swing between moral justifications for abolition and material justifications for abolition. And just really, for my money, like the most powerful sacred texts of the tradition do both, and do both unapologetically. And it's been such a treat to walk through with the students in the past semester, to see the alignment between Malcolm and Martin, the alignment between an analysis that David Walker gives, an analysis that Octavia Butler's narrative supports. Being able to see that this kind of disciplinary distinction between moral justification and material analysis is not useful in this particular context, and having an understanding of how these two things are integrated and mutually constitutive is actually more generative. But we have so many tools for thinking about them in isolation, we almost can't even have the language to talk about what it means to see them functioning with each other simultaneously. And I hear Joy James now, because I was just thinking about Jared's conversation with her from earlier this month, and I think Joy lives there too, in this kind of integrated relay between understanding of revolutionary love, which is the name of her new book, and the kind of material imperatives, economic, political, to get in the game and see how your skin is in the game already.
So good. So how about we'll take the last 3 questions? That way we have a little bit more time to mingle informally, ask each other some other things and all that. So we'll go, we'll start here and then we'll go there and then we'll go there. Yeah?
Sure.
All right.
Thanks. Peace and blessings to everybody in the room, especially our distinguished panelists here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom here, kind of sparking my own radical imagination here today. You just spoke about Martin and Malcolm. You talked about revolutionary suicide. I'm thinking of martyrdom right now. I'm thinking of one of our greatest sort of contemporary martyrs, Malcolm X, whose martyrdom anniversary comes up in 2 days. You talked a lot about African syncretism. A historian from Columbia University, Sylviane Bieuf, she estimates that about 30% of human beings stolen and transported during the transatlantic slave trade were Muslim. Right? And then you talked about kind of like the lingua franca of resistance. So what I'm wondering is possibilities here today, maybe even in West Philadelphia, for, Malcolm created this model of prison organizing, right? That's situated distinctly in a Black Muslim tradition. But what are the possibilities for the solidarity work with abolitionists of all types and stripes, or at least those interested in decarceration, right? Communists, anarchists, human beings that care about justice. What would you imagine based on your research and writing?
Hi, thank you
for what's been shared. I want to go back to the first excerpt that you read, Jasmine, about just like some of the nightmares that you've seen coming to life. And I'm also struggling as someone who has also had to, take a step back from organizing. But I'm struggling with the ways that abuse is rampant, both in organizing and in spiritual spaces.
Yep.
And I'm feeling very much like where we go when abuse is everywhere. And I think I also struggle with like kind of some of the language around cancel culture, like how it's used, and because I've seen it used to like delegitimize survivors, and I feel like the people I've seen be canceled are the survivors themselves. And like by the time something has even become public, there's like a trail of survivors already there. And I feel like people think we're losing people to cancel culture, but I'm like, we're losing people to abuse actually. And so I'm just like curious, like where are we supposed to go? Because some of these spiritual healers be the abusers too, let's be clear. So I'm just like in a very much like where we go from here, and what are the ancestral lessons that we can cultivate and draw on.
Thank you so much. My question probably in some way is also related to the last one. I think, the word accountability. I mean, Jasmine said after, when you said that, the wall, when we want to be accountable to each other after the wall falls. And also think in the idea of being accountable, academy being accountable to the street and to the movement. So I wonder if it would reflect a little bit on this, that there seems to be a little bit of tension between the kinds of things that in each of these going on. For instance, in organizing, obviously, the focus is to achieve certain goals and strategy, and everything has to be calculated from that perspective, which is different from, let's say, when in academy you think that your logical thinking should not probably be always subordinated to some kind of use and outcome. There has to be some kind of, if you like, uselessness to it in order to have some kind of life in it. So there seems to be some kind of tension between these areas. The same thing I could say about organizing and when you're talking about spiritual spaces, that they don't seem to be completely identical registers. So there seems to be some kind of tension in these two areas, that the registers of accountabilities are not identical. And how to negotiate that and how to navigate that, because that we know that can be the source of a lot of tension between very like-minded people who are on different sides of this. Thank you.
Thanks for those three questions. Maybe I'll just say something brief. It strikes me that there is it's very important and very hard to hold together the urgency of responding to the injustices that we find around us, and the work of formation and discernment that's also necessary to rightly respond to those injustices. And I don't think there's a shortcut in that tension, right? That it's just a tension that we have to hold together, and we're always going to get it a little bit wrong, and we always have to, of course, correct. And it strikes me that things like social media these days make it so that the urgency seems so takes primacy, and that sort of work of formation and discernment almost gets forgotten about. And of course, there are spaces where the formation and discernment work is, primary, and the urgency gets forgotten about. And I just want to underscore this second question, which I think I'm thinking through as well now in terms of abuse. I think one of the things I got wrong, or that I'm still trying to figure out, still want to see more about in this book, was the way in which abuse is not domination. These are two different things that we need to respond to, and they both have different structures, right? Different sort of phenomenologies, and we need to be able to name them in their distinctness rather than sort of collapsing them and imagining if we're just all together struggling against domination, then somehow there won't be abuse, and naming that sort of specificity of the characteristics of abuse, right? That when structures of domination or anti-Black racism become private rather than public, or at least have a private dimension, the public-private split looks different post 1970s than it did pre-1970s, right? We have to come up with new tools to respond, which I think we're still just starting to think through.
The thing that your question brings up for me is everything's got a breaking point. Everyone has a breaking point. The technology of slavery and prisons and carceral power is designed to find that breaking point for everybody. And in my own experience with being in the academy, being in practice spaces, being in the movement, because all of them are full of abuse, when people, even when they have the insight, the enlightenment, the tools, the history, the analysis, if they are physically, emotionally, spiritually, professionally, personally, put under the kind of pressure that can break them, they will no longer have integrity in the way that they hold those knowledges, the way they hold those practices, wisdom, and insight. And that's literally universal. We are all vulnerable to being broken and having the light that we have inside of us turned to negativity, nihilism, trash, violence. And so being very, very aware of our humanity. And not, one of the quotes that we use in the text and we use all the time, because both Rusia and Reverend Angel use them all the time, is a quote by Bruce Lee, that under pressure, you won't rise to your expectations or your highest ideals, you will fall back on your practices. It's just true. It's true in training for martial arts, it's true for training for abolition. And so being very clear with ourselves that we are vulnerable, and that our leaders are vulnerable, and that all of the people who have passed down this wisdom from, Mao, from Malcolm, from ancient wisdoms of resistance. Marronage is not a technology, an ideology, a practice that came out of slavery. It survived the Middle Passage, is what I just learned from Brazilian philosophers who are already decolonized. Right? They're not decolonizing philosophy, they just are. And so what I'm hearing is that we have to learn how to hold space for harm in ourselves and in our communities in ways that stop it at its root, instead of just punish its effects. And I think one of the punishing effects is the perfectionism and our expectation that our leaders will be flawless. And it's just true that, I studied religion before all of these things, and as religious traditions evolve and travel and migrate, they are always being impacted by political regimes and awful moments and awful leaders and awful people who are corroding and corrupting the thing, but the wisdom tradition survives. And it is our job constantly to turn the wheel and make it relevant to this moment. And I feel like relevance and accountability is not determinism, right? So I am accountable to my kid, but that doesn't mean I have any kind of determinacy over how that kid acts, right? So I can have an accountability to activist knowledges, but that's about conversation, relationality. That could change on a dime. Someone could tell me, like, you didn't come correct actually here, and now I have to shift, right? So the idea that any of this is fixed is fallacy, right? And we're just trained to expect that things can be checked and boxes can be marked and then we can keep it moving. But in fact, everything is fluid and nothing is determinate. And so we shape what accountability means. We shape what relationality looks like. And Black Muslims have been at the forefront of prison organizing since the very beginning. And I feel like you probably have more to share about the future of that kind of coalition.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think in some ways, I've been thinking a lot about coalition, and I'm not sure the way that I've thought about it is the right way a lot of the time. So one, so I'll give two kind of examples. So there was that Alabama prison strike that happened this fall. I wrote an article about that, if folks want to, aren't familiar with it. But one of the interesting aspects of it was that as is always the case, if you have mass participation inside, the street organizations were heavily involved. And but obviously it's not under just the direction of like one group, right? And to shift to a different example, we just had a conversation with folks that are from the Mohawk Nation they're in Canada, but the Mohawk Nation actually straddles both borders, the US and Canada. And so it's very interesting because you have this, really sovereign nation, right, that has to deal with all of these issues of borders and of, there's a lot in there. There's a book that's just come out that's called Mohawk Warrior Society, a handbook for sovereignty and survival. But one of the things they talk about in it is they talk about confederacy, and they also talk about what they had this agreement called the two-row wampum agreement. And it was their agreement with settlers initially. And basically it showed two lines, right, that didn't cross. And the Mohawks' point was, you follow your path and we'll follow our path. But don't mess our path up and we won't mess your path up, right? And I think that they talked about this in the conversation as a way to think about what confederation actually could mean in terms of organizing. And I think about that in terms of the example of how prisoners are organizing, because they're not all organizing under one formation. And I think that on the outside, there's a lot to learn from examples like that of saying, look, we're not going to agree on everything. And if I try to convince, if anarchists are going to try to convince socialists or vice versa, that's not going to end up going well, right? And similarly, across different religious faiths, there are going to be real spaces where you're not going to be able to always find common ground on a specific issue, but in order to be able to pursue some kind of goal or vision together, or a set of things that we can agree on, might require that we agree to head towards a specific path together, but not try to dictate the way that the other group approaches that, right? So I mean, in some ways, that's sort of like the diversity of tactics conversation to some degree, but I think it's a little bit broader than that, because it's trying to think for a left that is still too small, but is growing, and where you have a variety of tendencies, but a lot of shared vision, I really think, in terms of things that would like to see changed and things that are desired, of how you might go towards that. So.
Okay, wow. Well, I just want to say thank you so much for bringing your full selves and your thinking and your careful work to making worlds and to like allow us to sort of have this really rich and engaging conversation. Thank you all for your questions and for being here. We do have some time to just softly mingle if you all feel like doing that. And there are some books for sale, and we very much appreciate if you purchase them. So thank you for coming out, and thank you, Jasmine and Jared and Vincent, for your work.